Have you ever noticed those people sitting quietly in the corner of a coffee shop? Their fingers rest lightly on the rim of a cup. Their eyes aren't darting around the room, nor are they locked onto a phone screen. They simply stare out the window at something neither too near nor too far away. There may not even be a smile on their face, yet there's an indescribable sense of peace about them. I used to be terrified of becoming one of those people. When I was 26, I was working as an intern reporter at a newspaper in London. Every day, I carried a camera weighing nearly 7 pounds on my back and rushed through the city, chasing anything that might turn into a headline. My editor was a gray-haired Scotsman who always told me, "Livy, you've got the eyes of a hunting dog. That's a good thing." I took it as the highest compliment imaginable until one rainy Tuesday afternoon, when I met an elderly woman in a wheelchair. Her name was Margaret. She was 91 and lived in an old red brick house covered in ivy. I had gone to interview her for a feature story about lonely elderly people in the city, but the moment I stepped through her front door, I realized she fit none of the assumptions behind the story. She wasn't lonely, and she didn't seem like someone who had ever been afraid of loneliness. 20 minutes into the interview, I closed my notebook, not because I had run out of questions, but because I suddenly realized that questions would never reach the thing she carried within her, the thing that would take me another 10 years to slowly understand. Margaret's living room smelled like old books mixed with dried roses. 7 handmade ceramic jars of different sizes sat on the windowsill. She told me her husband had made them during pottery classes years ago. Not a single one turned out right, she said, but every one of them deserved to stay. Above the fireplace hung a faded photograph. In it, a younger Margaret stood on the deck of a sailboat. The wind had blown her hair into complete chaos, and she was smiling as if nothing in the world was worth worrying about. I pointed to the photo. "What were you thinking about back then?" She stared at it for a while, then answered in the same casual tone someone might use to recall a dessert recipe. "I was wondering if I could swim to the nearest island if the boat capsized. Turns out I couldn't." But that thought lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then I went back to enjoying the sun. Something about that hit me, though I couldn't explain why. That afternoon, I stayed in her living room for 4 full hours. As a reporter, that was a terrible use of time. 4 hours was enough to finish multiple street interviews, organize recordings, and write a 1,000-word draft. But Margaret made me forget about efficiency. She told me about London in 1943 when she worked as a telegraph operator. Night after night, she sat in air raid shelters, listening to explosions rumble overhead while receiving coded messages from the front lines through a heavy machine. I waited for her to tell me about fear, about sleepless nights, about clutching someone's hand in the darkness. Instead, she talked about something else. "There was a boy in the shelter named Albert," she said. "He was 3 years younger than me. One day he found a mouse. Instead of screaming, he started saving tiny pieces of his bread every day to feed it. Eventually, the thing got so fat it could barely run. We used to joke that it was the best-fed mouse in all of London." She laughed, and the wrinkles around her eyes spread like ripples across water. "That happened the same night. Bomb landed less than 200 meters from us," she continued. "The whole shelter shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Some people started praying. Some people started crying." She paused. "Guess what Albert was doing?" I shook my head. "He was trying to come up with a name for the mouse. He spent all night thinking about it and finally decided to call it Winston because Churchill was fat too." I sat there, suddenly struck by a deeply unsettling realization. If I had been in that shelter, I probably would have been one of the people praying or crying. And even if I survived, years later I would probably tell the story through fear, despair, and how close death had come. But Margaret remembered Winston. What's the difference between those 2 ways of seeing the world? 3 months after that interview, I experienced something else. I was photographing a protest along the Thames when I met a young man named Callum. He was 26, the same age as me, but his life couldn't have looked more different. He worked as a sailing instructor and spent his summers taking students across the Solent. After we finished talking about the protest, I casually asked him about his job. His whole face lit up instantly. "Have you ever been out at sea?" he asked. I said no. "You should," he said, his eyes suddenly bright like someone had struck a match behind them. "Not on a cruise ship, a real sailboat. You're sitting on the edge of the boat with freezing water beneath your feet, the wind pushing all your hair back, and the whole boat leans at an angle you swear shouldn't be possible." He leaned forward. "You think this is it?" We're going over. But you don't. The boat doesn't flip. It just keeps moving, tilted over the water like a bird flying inches above the surface. I felt drawn in by his description, but at the same time, I felt something familiar rise inside me, that old anxiety. The need to experience something immediately mixed with the fear of missing my chance. But I can't really swim, I said. And I get seasick. And I hate being cold, and... He laughed and interrupted me. Not a mocking laugh, just a warm one. You know what's really dangerous, he said. It's not the ocean. It's that hand inside you that's always trying to control everything. As he said it, his hand rested open on his knee, as if he had just let something go. The first time I take students out to sea, they all ask the same questions. What if the wind changes? What if the waves get too big? What if the boat flips over? He said. And I tell them none of those things are actually under their control. The only thing you can control is the relationship between your hands and the sail. The rest, he said, you give to the ocean. But what if the ocean doesn't catch you? I asked. He looked at me. There was something strange in his eyes, something that reminded me of the way Margaret stared at old photographs. The ocean always catches you, he said. It just doesn't always catch you in the way you expected. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tiny rented apartment, listening to the endless traffic below, replaying things over and over in my head. Winston the mouse in the air raid shelter, and an open hand holding on to nothing. I started examining my own life. What did 26-year-old me actually have? A low-paying job with my name printed beneath my articles. A planner that needed to be rewritten every 6 weeks. A carefully polished version of myself that looked presentable in social situations. And an incredibly detailed blueprint for how my future was supposed to unfold. I lived like someone playing 10 chess games at once, calculating 5 moves ahead for every step, creating backup plans for every possible outcome. I used to think that meant I was capable, that I was taking control of my life. But for the first time, I wondered whether it was actually something else. Maybe it was just a prolonged panic attack disguised as ambition. Margaret and Callum both carried something I couldn't name but could feel intensely. It felt like a way of standing before fate, not bowing to it, not fighting it with claws out, just standing there, acknowledging that life is uncontrollable without collapsing into fear or emptiness because of it. A mindset that could still name a mouse while bombs were falling 200 meters away. What exactly was that? It took me almost 10 years to slowly piece together the answer. The first crack in my life appeared when I was 29. A relationship I thought was unbreakable ended on an ordinary Wednesday evening. There was no screaming, no betrayal, no dramatic reason at all. He simply put down his spoon while eating soup and said, "I think we're both acting in a play, and I don't even know who we're performing for anymore." The sentence hit with terrifying force because it touched something I had spent years refusing to face. For the first 3 months after we separated, I became like a malfunctioning machine. I kept repeating routines that no longer meant anything. Wake up, work, socialize, smile. Everything on the outside looked normal, but inside, the gears had stopped fitting together. I filled my planner with new goals and new schedules, trying to repair the pain of losing the past by controlling the future. None of those plans ever happened, because they had never been things I genuinely wanted. They were painkillers, nothing more. Until one day, I completely fell apart. I sent my editor a rambling, barely coherent email asking for time off, turned off my phone, and spent 2 straight days lying in my apartment. On the morning of the 3rd day, I woke up and saw sunlight forcing its way through a gap in the curtains, spilling across my pillow like a small golden lake. I stared at it for a long time. Then I did something that felt completely unlike me. I didn't make a plan for the day. I walked outside, got onto the first bus that was about to leave, and let it take me wherever it wanted. The bus crossed the city, passed the suburbs, and eventually stopped near a small town I'd never seen before. I got off and followed a muddy path until it ended at a river. The river wasn't wide, but the current was fast. Wild grass grew along the banks, reaching nearly to my waist. I stood there for a long time, long enough for my legs to go numb. Then, for reasons I still can't explain, I took off my shoes and lowered my feet into the water. It was painfully cold, but the cold felt honest. Unlike grief always carries a kind of deception. The current pressed hard against my ankles, strong enough that I had to constantly shift my balance. And somewhere in that shifting, I suddenly understood what Callum had meant. The only thing you can control is the relationship between your hands and the sail. The rest, you give to the ocean. I had always thought he was talking about sailing. Now I understood. He was talking about everything. The river didn't give me answers, but it taught me one thing. You can stand in moving water without being swept away. Not because you've learned to control the current, but because you've learned how to live with it. Then at 33, I met the real storm. My mother was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. I was in the newsroom editing a cover story close to deadline when my father called. His voice sounded calm, too calm, like he was reading a weather report that had nothing to do with him. But I knew him. He had always been that kind of person. The more something mattered to him, the more casually he talked about it. After hanging up, I realized I was standing in the doorway of the newsroom, still holding my phone, with absolutely no idea where to go next. And for the first time, I understood something. The pain of heartbreak had only been a rehearsal. When life throws its real punches, you suddenly realize those old bruises barely counted. The next 2 years became the longest years of my life. My mother's memory retreated like the tide, slowly pulling away piece by piece. First she forgot where she left her keys. Then she forgot what day it was. Then she forgot she'd just eaten lunch. Eventually she would stare at my face for 10 full seconds and politely ask, "I'm sorry. Have we met before?" Every single time felt like a tiny needle sliding into my fingertips. Not enough to kill me, just enough to hurt. So I started searching desperately for solutions. The best hospitals, the newest medications, the most advanced clinical trials. I even tried things that sounded suspiciously like pseudoscience. I became 26 again, the version of myself with clenched fists, convinced that if I worked hard enough, if I was smart enough, if I found enough resources, nothing would be irreversible. But Alzheimer's isn't an article you can edit. It's a river that only flows in one direction. And while I was trying to fight that river, I met a woman named Cecilia in a hospital waiting room. Her husband had been diagnosed 2 years before my mother, and she had cared for him for 5 straight years. I poured out my anger, my fear, and my frustration. She listened quietly. Only after I finished did she speak. Her voice had the texture of something weathered by time, not perfectly smooth, but deeply comforting. When my husband was diagnosed, she said, "I was exactly like you. I thought I had to beat this. I thought I had to save him. I thought I had to bring back the person who was disappearing." She paused, then eventually I realized something. I shook my head. I realized that all the energy I spent fighting it could have been enough to give us so many beautiful moments together, she said softly. Moments that could have been spent holding his hand during walks, listening to the old songs he still remembered, sitting beside him during those rare moments of clarity and simply saying, "I'm here." She paused. "It took me 3 years to learn one thing," she said. "Some things you have to let go." Back then, letting go sounded almost identical to giving up. But when Cecilia said those words, there wasn't the slightest trace of defeat on her face. If anything, she looked like a soldier finally returning home after a long war, exhausted, but peaceful. On the subway ride home, I stared at my reflection in the window. The face staring back wasn't the young woman. I remembered the girl who used to run across London with a camera hanging from her shoulder. There were faint lines at the corners of my eyes, a crease between my brows, a jaw that always seemed slightly tense. Every mark felt like evidence of the philosophy I'd spent years living by. Push harder, hold tighter, try more. And what had all that effort actually done? The frantic plans I made after heartbreak hadn't healed me. They had only stretched out the pain. The desperate battle I fought against my mother's illness hadn't given us more time. It had only consumed the little time we already had. I started thinking again about Margaret's story in the air raid shelter. She and Albert were ordinary people too. They were afraid. They felt despair. But fear never swallowed them whole. Not because they were stronger than everyone else, but because they allowed something else to exist alongside fear. They allowed themselves to feed a mouse, to name a mouse, to leave a small part of their attention devoted to the warmth of life while the world around them was falling apart. For years, I'd believed there were only 2 ways to respond to life: win or collapse, control or be consumed. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe there was a third choice. When I was 36, I made a decision. I took a month of unpaid leave and flew to a small coastal town in northern Spain to learn traditional pottery from an elderly woman named Maria. The idea had come from Margaret's 7 ceramic jars sitting on her windowsill. Even after all those years, I still remembered what she had said. Not a single one turned out right, but every one of them deserved to stay. Maria's studio sat inside a stone house facing the sea. There were no electric kilns, only an old wood-fired oven. On the first day, she handed me a lump of clay and told me to make whatever I wanted. I spent 20 minutes trying to create a perfect bowl. I made every edge symmetrical, adjusted every curve over and over. Maria walked over, looked at it, shook her head, and pressed the entire thing back into a lump before placing it in front of me again. "Try again," she said. "This time, don't try to make a bowl. Just make whatever the clay wants to become." I stared at her. "Clay doesn't have ideas." "Yes, it does," she said, tapping a finger gently against my chest. "But it's too noisy in here for you to hear them." That afternoon, I stopped judging every movement and simply let my hands move on their own. In the end, I made something that barely looked like anything at all. It leaned to one side. Its shape was uneven. My fingerprints covered its surface. Maria placed it on a shelf to dry and said something that unexpectedly made my eyes burn. "You see?" She smiled. "You have your own shape." During that month in Spain, more things broke than I had expected. Not emotionally. Literally. The clay cracked in my hands again and again. Every time a piece split apart while drying, I felt a sharp wave of frustration. But Maria never let me throw the broken pieces away. She collected them in a woven basket. By the third week, the basket was nearly full. One rainy afternoon, she brought the basket onto the table and poured everything out. Then she began teaching me how to repair the fragments using lacquer and gold powder. The cracks were brushed with gold. Once they dried, the places that had once been broken became bright golden lines, more beautiful than the untouched parts. "This technique came from Japan," Maria said as she tucked a strand of white hair behind her ear with fingers stained gold. "It's called kintsugi. It doesn't hide the damage. It creates something new with it." I sat there in that stone house where I could hear the sound of waves outside and stared at the little bowl in my hands, covered in gold lines. And I cried, not because I was sad, but because I felt something I had never experienced before. Relief. I remembered Callum's open hand on that bench beside the Thames years earlier. He had said the ocean always catches you, it just doesn't catch you in the way you expect. Only now did I finally understand what he meant. The ocean doesn't catch you by stopping the storm. It catches you by teaching you how to sail through it. The things I once thought would completely tear my life apart had slowly become their own form of kintsugi. They weren't just scars anymore. They had become the most irreplaceable parts of who I was. The day I flew back to London, the plane descended through the clouds. I looked out the window and saw the city spread beneath me like a giant circuit board. Millions of people moving, planning, worrying, trying desperately to control things that were never truly theirs to control. I used to be one of them. In some ways, I still am, but not entirely. If you asked me now what that thing was, the thing I saw in Margaret all those years ago, but couldn't name, I think I finally have an answer. It's a deep awareness that life is a river you can never turn around in. Storms will come, hidden rocks will appear, unexpected rain will fall. None of those things will ever stop happening. And the highest mindset in life isn't building a ship that can never be damaged. It isn't mapping every route in advance. It isn't stocking enough supplies to survive every possible disaster. It's having the courage, while holding the wheel firmly in your hands, to look out at those unpredictable waters and say, "Come on, both of my hands are already busy living. I don't have time to be afraid." You stop asking fate why it brought these things into your life. You simply receive them and continue sailing. That mindset is like an old house. Its walls have cracks, but those cracks are exactly where the sunlight enters. It's like Margaret's imperfect ceramic jars. They were never flawless, yet they carried everything. It's like Callum's open hands, holding on to nothing certain, yet somehow embracing the entire ocean. It's like kintsugi, not hiding the places where you broke, but turning those fractures into your most unique source of light. To accept everything that happens, the beautiful, the painful, the ordinary, the terrifying, as an irreplaceable part of your life. Even while pain still lingers beneath the surface, you remain open and gentle toward what life might still bring. So loosen your fists. You've been holding on so tightly for far too long. Letting go isn't surrendering to fate. It's finally understanding that fighting and accepting were never opposites. Fate never speaks. It's only a river. And the only thing you can do, the only thing you ever could do, is stand steady in the current and move through it in your own shape. That is the highest mindset in life.